Are the rail strikes over? If you've been watching the news recently, you might know that there have been a few strikes in Germany, but the ones that have caused the most comment are those by train drivers. In fact, they did call a strike that was supposed to last for 2 days, from the 15th to the 16th of May, but that was called off at the last minute when the union reached an agreement with the Deutsche Bahn. So you might be thinking that this is the end of the story, but it's not. The dispute is still ongoing, and there is still a possibility that things could get worse. So, what's going on? Well, let's begin with the basics. There are two main unions that represent rail staff in Germany, the GDL and the larger EVG. Now, one of the most important things that a union can do is to agree on pay and conditions with the companies that its members work for. The problem is that employers have an awful lot of power. If the workers feel that their bosses are not being fair, what can they actually do? Well, to help adjust the balance of power, unions have certain rights, including the right to temporarily refuse to work. In other words, to go on strike. At the moment, the agreements that the EVG has with Deutsche Bahn and about 50 other rail operators are up for renewal, and so they're in negotiations. Now, the idea is that the companies offer way too little, the unions demand way too much, and then they argue until they meet somewhere in the middle. The negotiations with Deutsche Bahn are the most important because it is the biggest employer and because the other companies usually then fall into line with Deutsche Bahn. So that's why this is being seen as a dispute between the EVG and DB. In Germany, there are two basic types of strike. There is the so-called enforcing strike, or more colloquially, the full strike, which can be called if negotiations fail. There are certain rules about this. The most important of these is that first, the union must ballot its members, and only if a majority is in favor of the strike can it go ahead. But we're not at that stage yet. While talks are ongoing, the union has the right to call warning strikes. Now, for this, the union members don't have to be balloted, but the union must set a specific date and time for the end of the strike. It cannot be open-ended. There's actually no limit on how long a warning strike can be, but the expectation is that it lasts for a few hours or at most a day. The idea is to send a message to the employers. Here is a taste of what could happen if you refuse to give us a fair deal. Now, in the past, the EVG has usually managed to negotiate wage contracts without resorting to strike action. So what's different now that made it decide it needed to call a 50-hour warning strike? Well, two things. First, the obvious one, inflation. From the perspective of Deutsche Bahn, inflation means that there's less money to pay for things like staff wages. But from the perspective of the workers, inflation means that they need more wages just to be able to pay their bills. Second, well, remember how I said that there were two unions? The other union, the GDL, has in the past been quite quick to act tough and go out on strike. The EVG, by contrast, has often been criticized for being a soft touch, so that its members end up with bad deals. The EVG now has a new negotiating team which needs to prove that it can stand up to DB and get the workers the wages that they deserve. At the same time, DB needs to prove that it won't stand for any nonsense from the new negotiating team. This means that both sides want to act tough. So while the two sides claim to agree on principle, the details have suddenly become extremely important. And this is where it gets a bit complicated to explain because I'm not completely sure that I understand it myself. Since the current contract was drawn up, the legal minimum wage has risen quite sharply and is now at €12 per hour. And this means that DB is technically paying its lowest paid workers below minimum wage, but then topping it up with extra payments. One of the union's demands, as I understand it, is that the current minimum wage of €12 an hour be taken as the basis for which to calculate any pay rises, which Deutsche Bahn says it agrees to, but it won't apply it right across the board. Apparently, if it were to do this for cleaners and security staff, Deutsche Bahn would end up paying them something like €16 an hour, which is way above the industry standard. If you want my personal opinion on this, I'd say, where's the problem, Deutsche Bahn? You're always complaining about staff shortages. Maybe offering pay above the industry standard might be part of the solution. But apparently it is a problem, and because both sides have an incentive not to give any ground, they reached an impasse, which then led to the union calling a really long warning strike. For a few days, Deutsche Bahn basically tried to avert the strike by promising on its word of honor that it would not let negotiations fail over the minimum wage question, which is not the same as actually presenting a proposal that the union would be willing to negotiate. So in the end, DB took the union to a tribunal, basically so that both sides could argue in front of a judge. The judge warned the union that she wasn't completely certain about the legality of this specific strike, but also told DB that it really did have to put its promises in writing in their proposal. And so the union called off its strike with Deutsche Bahn, although not with all of the 50 other operators, so there were a few strikes. But it also warned Deutsche Bahn that if it went back on its word, there would be more strikes. What this means is that the strikes may not be over. This particular strike was called off not because the dispute has been settled, but because the two sides have agreed to talk about it. What happens next, I'm afraid, is anyone's guess. Without needing to resort to wage action? That doesn't even make sense. The is that the current minimum